Thank you. I approached Andrea when I came into the room to introduce myself, and she said, "Oh, I'm just a teacher." I said, "You're not just anything. You are the expert on this panel," and I still believe that. After listening to Andy and other members of this panel, I sat here and reflected on stories, and of course I decided I'm not going to use any of my notes because I never do. But you conjured up so many stories. When I think about my career in the school district over 40 years, starting at the age of 10, 19. But my background was in engineering. I had to sit here and think about what inspired me to stay in teaching, because I was asked to do it as an experiment for 1 year. My professor, the convincing professor, was Dr. Carl Hansen, who was the former superintendent in the school district. And I began at Jefferson Academy, but it was a subject area that was traditionally held by men. And of course, the first day the principal asked me to report back to HR because he was expecting a man. I was asked to teach drafting. The course that was taught by Dr. Hansen was in curriculum design, so I developed a curriculum for middle school drafting. He asked me if I would teach it, and they adopted it. So I thought, oh, wow, I need a job, pay student debt, first year, and go back to engineering. My first year was amazing. At the end of that year, midway, I had to file a complaint on behalf of the female students who wanted to take the non-traditional courses that males normally did. And of course, being a first-year teacher, not really knowing anything about contract, retaliation, angry principals, and all of that, I had to find a mentor, and it was the math teacher who was in my classroom every day trying to figure out why were students learning geometry fractions so much better now that they were taking my class. And she actually became my coach and mentor. And it made me think back to the very first day that Chancellor Michelle Rhee came into the district, and I was excited. I went to her press conference, took a half day from my classroom, and actually went to the National Press Club to hear her speech. And she opened with "Collaboration is overrated." Of course, that was one spiral down. And of course, later in her speech, she said, "After 5 years, you should go home."
Oh, no.
So I knew I was doomed then. When I thought about the fact that I had already completed almost 18 years of teaching in at least 3 schools, you've already answered the question that it's art, science, craft, job, and more than that. But as I reflected on my career in at least 6 schools in the District of Columbia, each chapter is confirmation about what you've talked about. The National Writing Project became that model. Teachers are the best teachers of other teachers became my savior in 1998 when I was about to quit. I was at my wit's end. The professional development was simply not relevant for me nor my students. I had reached a point where I felt as if the expectation level for certain students was lower than it was for others, and I could not accept that. The curriculum was rather scripted, and I was not a teacher that was trained to teach within the lines. I simply couldn't do it and still can't. Classroom lessons basically would deviate from the lesson plan on occasion because lessons would pop up in my classroom that needed to be taught at the time, and sometimes they connected to the lives of students, which made teaching for me far more exciting. The writing project, the model that they use. That summer, I was inducted into the Institute, the first one in D.C., the D.C. Area Writing Project. Richard Sterling actually came to D.C. to help us get that started. Richard and I became best friends over the years because that summer, I actually had decided to quit. I simply could not work within the structures that had been put in place for teachers. The 5 weeks in that summer institute with 25 other teachers who are still partners in my learning. I'm retired, but still members of the writing project. The work that we completed in that summer, basically for teachers who were interested in integrating writing in their content area. Writing became one of the most powerful tools for me to continue my career from that point forward, from middle school to high school. So I don't really need to confirm whether or not teaching is art, craft, or science. I simply want to share some stories, which teachers do, to confirm everything that you've said, When I think of one school I was assigned to here in D.C., which was one of the schools, the subject of the Brown v. Board case, I wasn't aware of it. When it came out in the Post one morning, I read it and went flying to school. Could not wait to share with my sixth graders that we are we are a school that is a historic landmark. And I remember sharing the story. I read the story to them, and they all sat and stared at me, and I couldn't understand why weren't they as excited as I was. And of course, one little girl shared with me that she wanted me not to feel upset or hurt, but the students simply were not interested in that history back there when I was a slave. So I had to share with her that I was never a slave, and of course, she was being very careful. And I knew that she said this not to hurt my feelings. The students were laughing, and I had to get over the shock of what she had said. But then, of course, coming back into the classroom and having the discussion with her about the importance of knowing the history of this school. Later they did. But it took art for me to do that. I knew my content area, but I did not know how I was going to engage students in wanting to know this story, this history. And it was actually going to influence and form the design, because each year they were required to design a school facility, a model school of the year for a competition. And this story actually would inform their design. So I actually went to Howard University, found a copy of the case, sat at my computer, and wrote an entire 7-page story, single-spaced, and took it to class the next day. And when I walked in, I simply said, "You all are not going to believe this, but there's a student who filed a lawsuit against the principal at this school because he refused to admit the students because he was black." And of course, they all went ballistic. Miss Davis, who was it? It was Antoine, I know it was. So, of course, I was excited that they asked questions because I knew I had them. And if I did not have the craft of teaching and the art all combined makes a great teacher. When I listened to Andrea, she didn't give up. She had to figure out another way to engage students. It may mean that you need to bring their lives into the lesson, connect the lesson to their experiences, make it come alive for them, whatever. But teachers who understand that is an art, craft, and a science know how to do that. And over the years, they began to develop the skills needed to do that. The math teacher, Mrs. Broadus, in my first year, would often come next door to my classroom wondering. She knew that I didn't know what I was doing. I had 42 students. She thought, "Are you aware that your class limit is over the caseload?" And I said, "No, what is the caseload?" She said, "It's 24 and you have 40 students." Well, I didn't know that that was a plan for the principal who decided maybe she'll leave if I gave her an excessive caseload. I thought that was the norm. I didn't know what special education was. So she had informed me that I had 15 special education students in the classroom. She said, "You know, I said, "Are they gifted?" She said, "No, they're kids who are not. They can't learn as quickly as others." But I never identified who those students were. They never gave me a list. So naturally, I taught the class as if they were all at the same level, capable of reading an engineering scale, capable of being able to look at a fraction on the scale and determine. And they did. Not at the same time or the same pace, but they got it. So the lesson for me in my first 2 years was that expectation is going to drive your teaching, what you teach. And it's also going to determine whether or not, how you will set the bar for students in your classroom, if you're going to categorize them into subgroups. Over the years, the lessons I learned from my students, which I did not think was possible, and I heard one of you mention the fact that we are lifelong learners. The lessons I learned from them was, don't you dare insist that my life and my community is not a part of your lessons. Because on one occasion, I do remember making that statement to a class who came in talking about something that happened in the community that weekend. And I said, "Students, I need you all to focus. We cannot bring the neighborhood into the school." I was wrong. And they taught me. They didn't say no. The behavior sent the message to me. You will not disengage lessons of what we're learning from our communities. And what we know when we come to class is valued. We have knowledge that we bring with us no matter who we are, our socioeconomic, race, class. Learning that lesson from students took 8 years. when I realized that the values, in some cases, myself included, I tend to have my own preconceived notions about who students are. And sometimes that shaped the lessons that I teach and also levels of expectation that I may set for them. And of course, learning from my peers, the math teachers, science teachers, authentic collaboration automatically happens. It can't be mandated. And of course, now we've moved towards testing, a test-crazed era where everything is driven by a test score. And teachers are focused on their evaluation score instead of the art and craft of teaching. The professional development may not be sufficient or adequate or relevant to what they're teaching. And in many cases, in many school districts, they're forced to comply with whatever is mandated by the school system. But what I'm noticing lately, and I wondered when Leo asked me to be on this panel, why? Because there are lessons that I'm also learning from the actions and the insurgencies that's taken place across the U.S. by teachers who are saying enough is enough. We're not being acknowledged for our expertise. I've only had the pleasure of attending one of the OECD summits, the one in Alberta, and I listened to those countries who attended that summit, supposedly the highest performing countries in the world, looking for the commonalities in professional development, how they regarded their teachers, what their focus was on, how much time students were in classrooms, and how much time teachers were spending collaborating with each other, practicing lessons with each other. And I noticed that the top 10 common things that they had in common, that we're missing the mark in this country and in many of those places. And a lot of it has to do with the focus. The fact that we have become so focused on testing as opposed to teaching content, teaching students how to critically apply the learning to real-world problems and not bubbling and right answers on a test. I've already gone off the path, and once I go off, I can't get back. So I'm going to defer some of my time and save the rest of the time for questions, because I think it's quite clear, based on what Andy and Tony and Andre have said, that teaching is an art, a science, and a craft. It's just a matter of determining how do we make it possible for those who set policies to understand that, and how do we take charge of our profession and becoming the decision makers as opposed to those who sit at the top of the heap making decisions that they know nothing about.